We are going to kind of be gathering questions. I know people who are virtual guests have been also bringing in questions, and so we are collating everything. Anything that we don't have a chance to directly address tonight, we're going to be keeping those questions and going through them, and the ones that we can provide answers to tomorrow, we'll provide answers to tomorrow, and others are going to be things that we use as a basis for the summary report and the workshop for this spring. So this final phase of the evening, like I say, is going to be focused primarily on what are the questions that we have. I would like to ask, I'm going to give us a little bit of a level setting for what we're going to do here. So we're going to have you guys break into groups and discuss in groups what your biggest questions are. And we have a system for how we're going to do that. Those questions will ask you to kind of write down questions and bring them up to these maps. And then we have a group of panelists that are going to help us address the questions that are coming up. And so what I would like us to do as we're kind of getting organized and getting the slide up is I would like to introduce the person who's going to be facilitating this portion of the evening. That is Dr. Denae King, who is the Associate Director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University. And I would also like to invite all of the panelists who are going to be responding or helping answer questions to just come up momentarily and introduce yourselves. And then I'm going to pass this to Dr. King to help with those introductions and with the next steps.
I'm so excited to see so many different people from different sectors with different points of views here tonight. I think I've learned a lot already just in the couple of hours that we've been here. And so I hope that this will continue to be an informative workshop for all of us. So our next steps include you all getting into groups and really writing down your questions that you'd like our panelists to answer. And remember, these are our 4 major areas that we're trying to get questions for and answers to. So if you have questions about air quality, write those down. If you have questions about pipeline safety or groundwater and seismic impacts and any other questions that you have, you can put those in the section on the end that says other questions and comments. Even if you have a comment, that's fine. Put your comment down. So under there's like little colorful Post-it notes under chairs, strategically placed. I didn't do that, but they're strategically placed. I actually saw some of them. And so that's what you'll use to do your notes. Are you finding your strategically placed Post-its?
So not everybody has a Post-it note. If you have a Post-it pack under your chairs, you're going to be a group leader. And you should hold up your Post-it notes so that people who don't have a Post-it note can find a group leader. And so go find somebody who's got Post-it notes and stand next to them and ask them all your questions. And those people who's got the Post-it notes, you're going to write those down and bring them up here. And I and my colleague Hannah are going to take those Post-it notes and get them all up on this board for Dr. King.
Hold up your Post-it notes high so people know where to go. And I just want to say that I did not design this, so don't be upset with me if you were selected as a note taker. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So if you guys don't have notes, make sure you're standing next to somebody who can write things down for you.
And I want to point out that we are running behind time. So the longer we take to do our discussion, the longer it takes for us to get to dinner.
Hello. So everyone could take their seats. We're going to get started in this session. Please take your seat. Yes. Thank you. All right.
All right. So before we get started with the question and answer, Greg is back to speak to the question about the map, and so we'll do that really fast, and then we'll introduce our guests who are going to speak to us about our first Q&A session.
Okay. I just wanted to put the map up that didn't get shown earlier that talks about the location. which we're calling the South Texas DAC Hub, the Claybrook County DAC Hub. And so I also didn't, since my slides didn't show, I didn't get a chance to talk I mentioned I didn't say what I exactly wanted to say. So I had some planned remarks around the benefits of direct air capture and the opportunity for this benign technology that really is an exciting opportunity, and that is the reason the department is interested. So I wanted to give Assistant Secretary Crabtree a chance to add a little bit of color to and context about DAC Hub, since he is one of our leading experts in the nation.
Great. Thank you so much. And direct air capture technology has not been around as long as carbon capture technology. The first carbon capture facility actually was started in West Texas in 1972, so there's a half centuries of experience. Direct air capture is just becoming commercial now. The largest project in the world is in Iceland, and it's capturing 4,000 tons of CO2 a year directly from the atmosphere, and then storing that CO2 geologically. This project will be one of the first to go to truly large commercial scale. The technology, the system that they are developing uses known technologies that are available in the energy and industrial context for a long, long time. And the goal here is to demonstrate the ability to take CO2 from the atmosphere at a larger commercial scale, and then to show that it works at that larger scale, and to bring the cost down over time. I can't remember who it was. Actually, it was Scott mentioned that direct air capture technology is a lot more expensive than carbon capture technology. So if we want this to become a solution in the future, we need projects like this today to help show that it works at a large scale, but then also the more projects that you do helps to bring the cost down. We saw that with wind and solar. You know, decades ago, solar technology was very, very expensive. Now it's very, very cheap, and that's the result of doing a lot of solar development for many, many years all over the world. We saw the same pattern with wind energy, and the goal here is to do the same thing with these types of technologies. And the CO2 that is captured from the ambient air, you'll see it'll be stored in saline geologic formation. The Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi has some of the largest saline geologic formations in the world that can hold extensive volumes of CO2. And you heard from Bill the long history we have at DOE in the Carbon Safe program to show that in a systematic way, that we know how to store CO2 in these reservoirs. And that's what this project will do with that CO2 that's captured. So thank you for correcting the map. And I just wanted to share a little bit of context. The project that's being supported in Louisiana is a different technology. It's a different pathway for capturing that CO2 from the atmosphere. But in each case, the goal is to show that these technologies can work, again, as I said, capturing more and more tons per year and bringing the cost down over time. So anyway, just a little bit of a bit more background.
Thank you very much. Dr. King, I will pass it over to you, and our guests who are speaking to air quality. Do you have the? So can we go back one? Yeah, that one. Okay. Okay. So joining us this evening to speak about air quality is Leticia Gutierrez from Air Alliance Houston and John Thompson from the Clean Air Task Force. Excuse me. Is Leticia here? Okay. And I'm going to give this to you guys to share.
Thank you. Stand.
You understand?
Yeah. So I'm going to have my colleague here as well.
Oh, okay, great. So we have some really good questions related to air quality. One of the first questions is if there's peer-reviewed evidence that CCS reduces co-pollutants. I think John said he would take that one.
Sure, I'm John Thompson with the Clean Air Task Force, and we're releasing a study soon on this kind of topic. The peer-reviewed articles that we relied on to do our study came from places like Carnegie Mellon, and I'd be happy to try to pull together a bibliography for the group on this. Generally, what we've found is that with carbon capture, the technology's been around for decades, and so you can actually go out and see in different air permits, the reductions on things like sulfur dioxide, on PM, and on NOx at those kinds of facilities. So, for example, if you went to the Petronova facility and pulled all the air permits, as we did, and actually looked at the hour-by-hour monitoring, when the capture equipment is running on that coal plant, the sulfur drops to, really negligible levels. And when it's offline, it goes back up.
Okay, thank you. The next question is,
Next question, how would this create a better air quality for Texans and Houstonians, and how bad is the air in Houston? Well, we are near 500 industrial facilities in the area. As a government relations and community outreach person for the organization, I can tell you that we're constantly having to request permit hearings for industrial facilities on a consistent basis. EPA just offered a $500,000 grant to monitor benzene in the area. We have Valero in Manchester that's spewing hydrogen cyanide. So there's just so much. There's concrete batch plants that are consistent to pop up. It's not good, which is why I do this work. And so we're a little nervous about this as well, just because we have a state regulator that is a reluctant regulator, as we call them. And so we did hear Matt Tejada with some great ideas, but unless EPA is forcing industry to do these things and to make sure that they're using the EJ screens and making sure that things are being done right by community, we don't trust. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. But
additionally, the Houston area has one of the largest air quality monitoring networks in the world, but that information is not necessarily public facing. That is a network that is maintained by private industry, and that information is kept behind closed doors.
So, do you want me to? So I'm going to read this question. Are there any measurable co-benefits locally for removing CO2 from the air? So what we found is that when you operate carbon capture using amine technology, you remove 99+% of the sulfur dioxide. And we've looked at this, and that's true really whether it's on any kind of plant. But the other pollutants, NOx, PM, those vary by speciation of the chemicals. So when we've looked at refineries and the cat crackers, what we'll see is, yes, all the sulfur dioxide goes down. At least that's what we would expect. The variability on the NOx, it might be between 2% reduction up to maybe 73% reduction. PM is usually about 95%. And this happens because you have to pre-treat the flue gas in order for the capture equipment to work, because these pollutants bind with the amines that remove the CO2. It's the chemistry. And if you don't capture them in the flue gas, the amine will, and it will cost you a lot more money. So I know that there's a lot of distrust in communities who've lived next to these emitting facilities. And they say, well, for 40 years, my parents, my grandparents, and my kids have had to live with these pollutants. Why is this going to be any different? Don't we have regulations, and haven't those regulations always been ignored? And I have a lot of sympathy for that concern. What I can say is one thing that's different about carbon capture is that there are tax credits for these people to capture the CO2. And if they don't capture the CO2, they don't get paid. It's that simple. They don't capture it, they don't inject it and store it, they don't get the money. So they invest all this $1 billion in equipment, and they don't get to repay any of that if they don't get the money. So it's a different thing right now because the regulations aren't what's driving it, it's the incentives. So you could say, well, that's not good because it's taxpayer dollars. But on the other hand, you're going to see 90% of the CO2 from these equipped plants go down, or 95 or greater. And you're going to see a lot of these co-benefits go down. And it's because of the tax credits, not the regulations. So you don't have to trust the company, you have to trust the chemistry.
What areas within Houston are most vulnerable, and are community members aware of their exposure? So as Reverend Caldwell so eloquently put it, and so did Matt Tejada, you know, I'm not a scientist and we're still learning about a lot of this. And being able to absorb it and also explain it to community, no, they're not aware. And the communities that are going to be exposed are the ones that are currently already being exposed. They are our minority communities, predominantly also immigrant communities that are afraid to speak up as well, especially with the whole slew of anti-immigrant bills that just came through the ledge a couple of days ago. So this makes our work really hard, extremely hard. It's on purpose. And so, no, they're not aware, and it's very scary.
All right, one more question. How might CO2 leakage affect air pollution? So CO2, in its purest form, 90+% as it's supposed to come out or go through the pipeline, is heavier than air. A leakage could be followed by an explosion outright, which we have a very real example of that going down in Sartarsha, Mississippi, in which a CO2 pipeline did rupture. And because it's heavier than air, it wants to sit at the surface. And when it sat on the surface under the road and by the roadway, it was, when motor vehicles pass through it, the ignition of the vehicle is put out, and the vehicles stop in their place, and people start to suffer asphyxiation. You can't breathe straight CO2. You need oxygen. And for that reason, many, many people were hospitalized, with many people suffering permanent neurological damage. So this is to say that in catastrophic failure, there is serious risk. And that doesn't even, that's in the most extreme situations.
And just to add, we got lucky nobody died at Sartarsha. I mean, that's just the way it was. Within minutes, really, in some people's case. I think the other thing to think about on this is that what caused that was a landslide, 35 feet of soil moving over after some really heavy rains.
We have a lot of floods here.
And so it's really important to take care of those special circumstances. We've had CO2 moving in pipelines for 50 years, 500 million tons of it, and no fatalities. And we're lucky because Sartarsha didn't have a fatality, but it was luck. I did want to add one thing on the nobody's asked about the negative parts of the carbon capture emissions. One emission goes up, VOCs. So in order to do absorption of CO2, you have to use amine. And one of the things that comes out of that is VOCs. Probably if you're capturing in the order of 1 million tons of CO2 a year, you're looking at maybe 3 tons more of VOCs being emitted. Volatile organic chemicals. So volatile organic chemicals contribute to ozone smog. And usually in, say, a refinery, you've got a lot of VOCs. They're coming off of tanks. They're coming off of a lot of things. But you are getting a new source with carbon capture. And it's, in a refinery context, it's less than 1%. It's maybe 0.5% increase compared to the whole plant. But these are an increase. And it's not just the VOCs that go up. It's also the things like nitrosamines. I think Scott was mentioning that. And these can be potent carcinogens. Now, they're at non-detect levels, but looked at that a lot in Europe, and they've said that's not a concern. I think it's one of those things that we don't really have ways to measure it because the equipment is so low. So I think it was Reverend Caldwell who wanted to say, tell us both sides. Don't just tell us one thing. So I'm telling you, the lives saved, at a typical refinery that we looked at, like in Beaumont, is probably 2 to 5 lives a year saved on the co-reduction, on the co-benefits on the sulfur side, and the NOx side, and the PM side. But you do get a VOC increase. You do get some other kinds of things.
And as you mentioned, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say we're going to answer one more question, and then we'll move on to our pipeline safety group.
As you mentioned, VOCs contribute to ozone, which we're currently in non-attainment right now in the region, so not a good idea. Next question. I have breast cancer, and when I go to the doctor, there is nothing they can do about my air quality. Can we have a hotline for free air quality inspection? Well, we have a state regulator that is supposed to be doing that. And can definitely call the hotline. I don't have the phone number, my phone in front of me, but that's what we're supposed to do. And you can also call the county pollution control, as well as we are basically a go-between. We log a lot of the complaints. But I hate to say this as well, the state just passed a bill that if you put in 3 complaints and TCQ can tag you as frivolous, they can ignore your complaints. So that's what we're dealing with here at the state of Texas. So that's why things like this concern us, because when bills like this are coming down the pike to basically discourage community, discourage Hispanics, discourage really anyone that's living near industry to report, it makes our job a little harder and more distrusting.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for the air quality section. Thank you. Now I'd like to bring up our panelists for the pipeline safety questions. We have some really good questions. Even some of them I was like, oh my God, I would love to know the answer to some of these. So I'd like to bring up Keith, Bill, Andy, and Paige. Would each of you like to just quickly introduce yourself and just tell us who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, my name's William Lowry. I go by Bill. I work for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I've been there for 23 years. I've done numerous pipeline inspections. Presently, I work for the Community Liaison Group, which is our public-facing group. Since we a number of years ago recognized we need to have more communication with all the different stakeholder groups. Oh, go on.
I'm Andy Martinek. I'm the Senior Pipeline Permitting Specialist at the Railroad Commission of Texas. I've been with the RRC for almost 4 years. I'll pass it on to Keith.
My name is Keith Grimes. I've been with the Railroad Commission for about 9 years now. I am the lead for our Houston Division of Pipeline Safety.
My name is Paige Powell. I'm a policy manager at Commission Shift, and I'm an alum of Air Alliance Houston. Go.
Okay, first question is, how many miles of existing pipeline will be refurbished for CO2 use?
Refurbished, I don't have an answer to that.
So I think the question is, there's a perception that the current pipelines that are for oil and gas will now be used for CO2 or hydrogen.
Understood. I don't have any information regarding the refurbishment of them, but it's certainly something we can look into for sure.
So the next question would be, how are... Okay.
I've spoken with a couple of pipeline safety experts who say that it's really a terrible idea to retrofit these pipes, that they weren't built to the right specs, and that it's going to take a lot of, inspection and analysis. Every pipeline is different. Every condition is different. So it's really best case scenarios to just build the pipes from scratch, that this retrofit is really setting us up for future failures.
So presently in the regulations, if you want to repurpose a pipeline from a natural gas pipeline or a what we call a 49 CFR 192 pipeline to a hazardous liquids pipeline, what we call a 49 CFR 195 pipeline, there is a requirement for conversion to service, as it's termed, and that requires an analysis, testing, some engineering, and some inspections and so forth. It's got to be a written procedure that's technically sound and feasible. Now, in the way it's written, is anything that isn't presently operated as a regulatory 195 or 192 pipeline, if it becomes that, then it would have to go through this conversion to service. The problem is, in 195, it doesn't really discern between the different types of hazardous liquids pipelines. So there is the possibility that someone would try to do what you're saying, do a repurposing. I have actually seen a pipeline operated as a CO2 pipeline that was previously in natural gas liquid service or highly volatile liquid service, and it was built to a higher pressure spec. It was built with 900 series flanges, fittings, and pipe and so forth. So that gives you a design pressure over 2,000. So yes, you're correct. Every situation is going to be different, and I would agree that it would be better to have a purpose-built pipeline if you're going to do this. So we are working on new regulations. We're supposed to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking, hopefully early next year, and this is one of the issues we're trying to address.
Clarification: you're calling CO2 a liquids category, or why would you say that?
If it's supercritical, yes.
Can you explain the question you just asked?
Because liquids has different properties. So liquids have different properties, and you have to coat the pipeline a certain way. And I wouldn't have categorized CO2 as a liquid. That's why.
The CO2 is going to be under such high pressure and specific temperature that it acts as both a liquid and a gas. It has both properties, as known as a supercritical state, correct?
So yeah, and that's something else that's supposed to be addressed in our proposed rulemaking, and that would be the fact that we need more regulations for if anybody's going to use the pipeline to transport it in a gaseous state, because at present, and I've done inspections on CO2 pipelines. I've led them. I've been involved. Was on one in Wyoming this year. So yeah, we recognize there's some gaps there, and we're trying to address those, especially since Tarsha. Being the notable incident that it was, because there wasn't a lot of those types of high-profile incidents with CO2 prior to that. What happens is we'll issue this notice of proposed rulemaking, and there'll be a comment period, and you can go to, I believe it's regulations.gov, and look for the docket, and you can make public comments prior to the rule being finalized.
So to confirm, there are currently limited regulations for CO2 pipeline safety.
The regulations we have are in 49 CFR 195, and they only apply to the CO2 in the liquid phase.
In the liquid phase.
But we do have, there's a difference between Code of Federal Regulations and U.S. Code, and we do have the authority, and are in the process of promulgating regulations for CO2 transported through pipelines in the gaseous phase.
Okay. What are the specific concerns about CO2 pipelines as it relates to regulations and also safety? So as you are asking us to begin to think about providing comments during the regulation period, during the public comment period, what kinds of things should we be considering to make comments about?
I would like to start by saying that's correct that PHMSA does not have comprehensive CO2 rules to cover all phases of CO2, yet they are still issuing permits and CO2 pipes are able to be built. So there are some in this country who are calling for a moratorium on new CO2 pipelines until there are comprehensive safety rules in place. Secondly, we do know that CO2 is an asphyxiant. It can cause long-term neurological damage. Everyone says what happened in Satartia was a fluke, and they were very, very lucky that no one died. We don't like to talk about Satartia because that puts the onus on the community. It was a Denbury pipeline that ruptured. Denbury is now owned by Exxon. And Denbury swears they didn't do anything wrong. Everything was fine, that it was a force majeure, an act of God that rained down and flooded out this area and caused the pipeline to shift. Now, in an era of climate change where we're going to experience more extreme weather events, more droughts, more floods, we're going to see more shifting land, particularly here on the Gulf Coast where we have the most subsidence in the country. We're going to see rigid pipe infrastructure breaking. We have some of the most, if not the most, hazardous pipeline incidents in the United States already. You add more pipelines, we're going to see more problems.
So that's a great segue. This question relates to sea level rise. And so this person wants to know, at sea level, what precautions are being taken to prevent harm as we think about CO2 and pipeline safety?
One point of clarification I need to make. PHMSA is not a permitting agency. We cannot either green light or stop a project. We can't give them the go-ahead. We cannot shut a project down. We simply do not have any permitting authority whatsoever. Permitting authority is, in liquid pipelines, is rests with the state and the local authorities to the extent they have that authority. As far as threats from tidal activity or surge or storms, these sorts of things, we have regulations that talk about taking into account, shifts, seismic. These are fairly new regulations, granted, but the integrity regulations have been around for 20 years or more now, and they basically require a pipeline operator to assess their threats and their consequences. And if they have this type of activity and they don't have a plan, they don't have it written into their procedures, they haven't addressed it to the extent of their ability, whether through design or mitigation or preventive or mitigative measures, then in reality they're not in compliance with the pipeline safety regulations if it is truly a threat.
Sorry, did we answer the question, what is being done, right? Can someone from the Railroad Commission answer, maybe?
Is there a specific pipeline location?
No.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay. One last question. This question is about corrosion and pipelines. So we talked about liquid and gas. How do they impact CO2 pipeline corrosion?
So there's internal corrosion, there's external corrosion. As far as external corrosion goes, it would be similar to other liquid pipelines. We have regulations that require cathodic protection. It has to be maintained at certain levels. It has to be surveyed at in certain periods of time, certain intervals, and that's all the same for pipelines. A lot of it depends on where you're at, whether you're offshore or close to the coast or in the desert or wherever. You are required to have a program. You're required to have people that are trained, and you're required to have the documentation that you've got an effective cathodic protection program and corrosion prevention program. As far as internal corrosion, the the best thing you can do is something like a CO2 pipeline is keep it dry, keep the water out of it. If there's not water, it won't form carbonic acid, and you won't have the problems. The other things you can do is you can run cleaning pigs, and the other things you can do for both internal and external corrosion is you can run inline inspection tools or smart pigs and collect the data that would indicate where you might have anomalies and defects.
Please join me in thanking our panel on pipeline safety. Thank you. So let's get started. Our first question is related to kind of how is carbon stored underground? So just basically over time, and does it have any risk?
Carbon is stored underground by injecting it deep. It's required under the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 to protect fresh water and the jargon underground sources of drinking water. So it has to be below and isolated from them, and you have to write a massive volume showing the regulator that that's true. The CO2 is in a rock, in the pore spaces. Tomorrow I'll bring you some examples. You can look at them to see how the CO2 is stored. It's in tiny spaces, which makes it secure. So imagine diapers. Something goes in there, it won't come out. That kind of storage, which increases the security. Nothing is without risk. When we do projects, we have a very intensive health and safety program. We're mostly worried about very concrete risks like overhead risks and driving accidents. And we talked about CO2 handling safety. You have to protect. We put alarms and we surveil it. The deep underground, storage deep underground is not very high risk because it's a long way from people, a mile or two through solid rock, literally. So we can talk more, so there's not absolutely risk-free underground, but it's in the small print. So we can ask me about the small print, but the situation is actually quite isolated from intersecting humans and bothering them.
The downside of that, probably the biggest risk with underground storage once it's been put there is if for some reason there's an abandoned well that nobody knew and detected and it penetrated the subsurface, and then CO2 under pressure could come through that, and that's where the diligence comes in. You really need, as part of the site characterization, you really need to find out where all the penetrations are to the levels where the CO2 is stored. And make sure that they are all securely plugged, which is sometimes not an easy task because there's tree trunks and everything down there. They're not really properly sealed by the old oil men.
Yeah.
So it's a real concern, but again, it can be, with diligence, it can be managed.
If I could add, can folks hear me?
Okay, yes. We forgot to introduce Sharon. Sharon, would you introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Sharon Newman. I'm a physical scientist at EPA headquarters, and I work in the Underground Injection Control Program, also known as the UIC program. And so the Safe Drinking Water Act authorizes the UIC program to regulate the injection of fluids underground via injection wells for the purposes of storage or disposal. And the goal of the UIC program is the protection of underground sources of drinking water. And I specifically focus on Class 6 wells. There are 6 classes of wells that the UIC program regulates, and Class 6 is for geologic sequestration or the injection of CO2 in deep subsurface formations for the purposes of long-term storage. And so I just wanted to add to that, to those comments that again, the UIC program, the goal is the protection of underground storage, underground sources of drinking water. And so the Class 6 rule, the geologic sequestration rule, is built upon the longstanding protective framework of the UIC program, takes into account the unique nature of CO2 injection. So thinking about how CO2 is corrosive, that it can be buoyant, the large volumes of CO2 that are anticipated to be injected into it. And I just also wanted to speak to the rigorous review process that goes into reviewing a Class 6 application. So we spoke a little bit about site characterization. So ensuring that that site, the applicant must demonstrate that the site is suitable to contain the anticipated volume of CO2 anticipated to be injected. And there's also a process, we mentioned corrective action and artificial penetration. So there's also, as part of that rigorous review process, a review of the area of review delineation, the area of review being that area around an injection well where underground sources of drinking water can be endangered. And so as part of the application, the applicant is required to predict the movement of the plume and pressure front in the subsurface using computational modeling, and then identify any artificial penetrations that would need corrective action.
Can I just ask a quick question? So can you speak to how long the groundwater monitoring is mandated? So you talked about the application process, and so after approval, how long is the groundwater mandate? The groundwater monitoring mandate?
So testing and monitoring continues throughout the injection and post-injection post-injection periods. There are a suite of monitoring requirements as part of the Class 6 rule, including indirect and direct monitoring. Indirect being things like seismic surveys, seismic monitoring. Direct being directly at the at the injection formation. There's all sorts of different types of monitoring, from operational parameters, continuous monitoring at the wellhead to determine pressure, and also groundwater monitoring, which is typically done at the first permeable formation above the confining zone. And then I also spoke about monitoring during the post-injection phase. So a well will not be closed until the owner-operator can demonstrate that there will be no future endangerment to underground sources of drinking water. And then I just wanted to mention lastly that if monitoring and those those monitoring results and reports differ at all from the predicted, for example, movement of the CO2 plume in the subsurface, then there will be a modification to the permit in order to ensure safety.
Excellent, thank you.
And the post-closure period is 50 years unless the applicant negotiates a shorter or a different period, or the regulator prolongs it 50 years.
Excuse me, I have a question I want to ask here. Thank you very much. And the question is, what is the connection between the abandoned wells and the CCS? And I'm Donna Thomas from Fort Bend County Environmental Organization, and I want to answer a little bit about that wells, because the wells in our county, and we are Houston, Fort Bend, we've had problems with the wells. In 2017, we had one of those wells explode on us, and it was the CO2s. And that well actually leaked for 3 weeks, and everybody was exposed, and cancer was detected. And so these things can happen, and don't play with it, because it's true. There's people that could be affected by this, being next to their homes, next to their communities. So I want you guys to be real about it. Thank you.
I agree. There is a real risk. The fortunate thing is most of the wells that have been drilled and abandoned, most of them are well above the levels at which the CO2 is being stored, and is investigated that there are layers of impermeable rock above that that barring some sort of penetration of that confining layer, most of the wells that are around do not go to that depth. So that's the one thing, but there are some that do. And that's why careful in site investigation and looking at all the old records and then there are techniques for going in and plugging those wells that are proper and that will be reliable. And that's what has to be done. It's diligence.
Ms. Donna, would you like to talk a little bit about your process in terms of community engagement before and following the incident?
Yes. We, at that time, we were on the news for a long time. They interviewed us in the community at the site when it actually happened. A professor came and interviewed and told everyone that at this moment, you guys are being poisoned through the air. And at that time, you need to get out and move from this site. Okay. So with that being done, everyone had to abandon the site. But 3 weeks later, we had to get somebody back out there because people were still getting sick and ill because the air was still being polluted. And from Fort Bend County Toll Road, from 2234 all the way to Highway 6, people were smelling that odor, and people were still getting sick. And it was notification information out to everyone in those areas. And everyone had to be tested if they want to be tested. But then, because the community always fall back from the public's eye because they don't want to be noticed about what happened in their community. So it's always a problem with the community engaging because now they don't trust anymore because of what happened. And the commissioners, the mayor, the city council, all those people were there at that time. But after 4 weeks or 4 months, nobody was there. But a lot of people was dying and a lot of people was getting sick. Thank you.
Was this an oil well or a gas well?
This was a CO2.
No, there's no CO2 injection in Fort.
No.
H2S. It's an H2S well, right? That's a very, very hazardous substance.
Yes.
But let's be clear. H2S is a different and much more hazardous substance. So don't mix up your chemicals. H2S.
No,
is
it's still
hazardous.
hazardous. It was
H2S is very hazardous.
They still said it was CO2 that was leaking that day from the yes.
But the hazard, it's not a CO2. So H2S is really hazardous.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make sure that we don't, muddle everything together because there
So
could be CO2
it sounds
with
like
too.
there were multiple.
I'm just letting you know they did say it was CO2, and they announced it was CO2.
But it's not a CO2 injection project. It's a
No, it was a well that was holding the CO2.
So was it an abandoned well?
And it was a well that was a lot of abandoned wells are there on that road, in the Fort Bend County area. We have a lot of abandoned wells.
We're in a perfect agreement about the hazards of H2S and abandoned well and the hazards of abandoned wells. So.
Secretary Kemp, did you?
No, that well was used for, I think at that time, was all the oil around that area. Was right, see, yeah. Right.
Right. So
we're talking about abandoned wells in our area that was exploded at that time.
It's a real H2S is a really bad hazard. So you have my sympathy, but it's important not to make everything equally bad. So CO2 is not as hazardous. It wasn't a failure of a permitted Class 6 CO2 site, which is important because it's not the oversight should be much stronger for Class 6, and you're hearing from Sharon about how much stronger it needs to be in this new rule set. Okay. Yes, near Alvin, yes. Of course, any well you could have a problem with. They're regulated by the Railroad Commission. They're in a project in near Alvin, south of Houston. They've been operating for about a decade. We did a bunch of, my group did a bunch of monitoring there, and also some other CO2 EOR sites. There are some incidences where CO2 wells have blown out in Wyoming and Louisiana. We haven't, but it's pretty rare. If you want to read about blowouts, the Railroad Commission puts the information. So look up Railroad Commission and blowouts, and you'll get all the reported blowouts of all the wells in Texas. They're not very particularly separated. You can read about it so that you see what's going on where.
So in lieu of, I know we have lots of questions about this, but because it's getting late, I just want to finish the one last question, and then can you ask your questions of our panelists after we finish? Thank you so much. So the one last question is related to earthquakes and your thoughts on pipeline safety as it relates to earthquakes. So what role does injection and pipeline safety, what role does earthquakes play in that? Any of the panelists.
I think we have to get the pipeline safety guys to talk about earthquakes and pipeline safety, because I'm not really up on what they do in like California.
As it relates to seismic and injection?
So I can talk about seismic and injection.
Okay.
My colleagues at the University of Texas the state of Texas set up a earthquake monitoring array called TexNet that's online public information. You can get the real-time reported events of any seismicity in Texas. And they do a lot of what I consider just really excellent work where there has been seismicity, which there's some incidences in the Fort Worth area, there's some in the parts of the Permian Basin, and there have been some incidences in South Texas. You can learn more about it. The injection in some areas can trigger earthquakes, and it depends on whether the energy in the earth is sufficient so that the increase in pressure could let loose something that's stored down there. It's not much of a big concern in the Houston area or up and down the coast because there's not a lot of energy stored in the subsurface. So in Houston and up and down the coast, there's been a tremendous amount of water injection over decades. And there's a good bit of monitoring, for example, on TexNet, and we don't see seismicity. This doesn't mean we should be cavalier or skip steps or skip permitting steps. And in fact, some of the projects that are being funded by DOE will have a seismic, in the general East Texas area, will have a seismic monitoring element that my colleagues are doing. So there's more information to come. But I don't think you should sit on the edge of your seat the same way other people do about seismicity. It's not as big a risk here because it has not been a big risk in past. Okay, so is that a moderate enough answer? Did you want to answer about pipelines and Ben? Yeah.
I can also speak to the protective framework of the Class 6 rule. So as part of that rigorous evaluation that needs to be done for a Class 6 application, applicants must demonstrate that the site that they selected is suitable for the injected CO2, and that means demonstrating that the site is free of active faults or fractures, which could hinder the CO2 containment. They must also demonstrate that the site is seismically stable, so they must demonstrate the seismic history of the area, and a site that is deemed unsuitable for geologic sequestration will not move forward. And then additionally, while we anticipate that, with proper site characterization, with proper well construction, with proper operating conditions, there would be no emergency situations to occur. There is an emergency and remedial response plan, which is a requirement by the rule. It's part of the permit application and becomes an enforceable component of the permit. And what this emergency and remedial response plan does is it's site specific and it outlines actionable items that must be taken in the event that anything would occur. And so seismic monitoring can be part of that, seismic plan as well.
As for pipelines, so our regulations require operators to take seismicity into account in their integrity plans if it's a threat. They also require operators to respond if there is a seismic event, to do certain checks and tests and inspections and so forth. From a practical standpoint, you know, if you know you're in a seismic area, I've seen operators put in extra valves so they can isolate in case of something that happens as a result of earth movement. I've seen operators put in strain gauges to try to monitor pipeline movements due to earth shifting or earth movement and so forth. And I've actually seen, at one time I saw a pipeline operator who had identified a fault line who welded their steel pipeline together in the shape of a spring and dug a box. This was out in the west, in the desert. Dug a box and filled it with sand or what they called non-cohesive material to create kind of a pipeline that would give and flex and so forth. And truly, if you've ever seen a steel pipe that's welded up and the wind comes along, it's pretty flexible in lengths and tends to be fairly tolerant in a lot of cases. Not in extreme cases, but in minor events as far as earthquakes and that sort of thing, they tend to be fairly tolerant.
Thank you. So just to ask one more question. We have been encouraged tonight to participate in community energy boards and community advisory boards for the various potential projects. Do the community benefits plans include what Sharon talked about in terms of the emergency remedial plan? Does anybody know the answer to that? No.
I'm not sure they do. Maybe that would be a good topic for 9:35 to 10:15 a.m. tomorrow morning.
I agree.
For on the community benefits panel.
It was just a question.
Hi, it's nice to meet you all. I'll be presenting tomorrow, talking all about community benefit plans. My name is Kelly Romer, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. I support the implementation of community benefit plans in our program. Emergency management and response plans are indeed part of the community and labor engagement section of the community benefit plan. So those are key points that we look to have addressed in these plans that are submitted for applications to qualify for funding.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for staying late, for asking wonderful questions. I think we all learned a lot from the great questions that were presented, and we will follow up with the additional questions in the other section. Be safe and have a great evening.